The anti-war movement against the Vietnam War began as a result of the retaliatory actions the U.S. made after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Americans didn't feel the deployment of troops in Vietnam was the solution to solving this initially minor conflict. People didn't feel comfortable going to a war with questionable causes for its existence. In fact, every single night the news would talk about the number of dead U.S. military who were killed and would show pictures from the war. And as a result, college students were beginning to become more active socially and politically, even beginning during the civil rights struggle. And as America became more involved in Vietnam and people started seeing all these pictures and hearing the number of U.S. dead, they became a more powerful, loud group of protesters. Well, the organization, the Students for Democratic Society, known as the SDS, organized these teach-ins on college campuses to express opposition to the war. SDS helped organize the first March on Washington in 1965, which had 20,000 protesters. Then in November of 1965, there was another protest rally of more than 30,000 protesters. Then due to the changes in the deferment status of students for the draft, SDS chapters on campuses increased over 400 and protests intensified. The anti-war movement went beyond college campuses, though, to include veterans and larger parts of the population. Folk singers actually used music as a way to popularize protests, and the largest anti-war protest was in 1967. Nearly 500,000 protesters protested in Central Park in New York City, and that was in the spring of 1967. And they had slogans such as "Burn cars, not people," and "Hell no, we won't go." In October 1967, there was one of the largest anti-war demonstrations in Washington, with 100,000 protesters gathering at the Lincoln Memorial. "1968 was a real year of turmoil. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were both assassinated, and then there continued to be huge student protests. In August of 1968, protesters went to the Democratic Convention because they wanted to pressure the Democratic Party to adopt an anti-war political platform. Some came, though, the people known as Yippies, they were known as the Youth International Party, they came hoping to provoke violence in order to make the Democratic Party look bad, because they didn't like them. The Chicago mayor mobilized the police and the National Guard to stop the protesters, but riots broke out, and the result was that the Democratic Party lost the election to Nixon, and then there were Republican presidents for a long time after that. Oh, Kent State was so sad. So as the war went on, protests increased, and there was no withdrawal. Nixon was the president, and he approved the invasion of Cambodia, which caused college students all over the country to erupt in more protests. The first general student strike in the nation's history occurred with more than 1.5 million students, closing down over 1,200 campuses. A large protest at Kent State broke out and led to the burning of the ROTC building. So as a result of that, the mayor called in the National Guard, and who fired live ammunition at the protesters, at the students. They wounded 9 people and they killed 4 kids, and that was all in 1970. It was horrible. As a response, over hundreds of colleges closed, and they closed for the rest of the semester. The weekend after Kent State, over 100,000 people marched on Washington to protest the invasion of Cambodia, and I was there for that one. President Nixon blamed the protesters and said, "When dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy." So my father took me and my brother to Washington to protest, and we were there, as I said, for that protest. And I remember walking up Constitution Avenue with thousands of others chanting, "What do we want? When do we want peace?" And we'd scream, "Now!" And we were holding peace now signs, and then we were waving our hands with the peace sign. Well, so the military was made up of people who were drafted. It wasn't a voluntary army. Um, Once a male turned 18, he had to register for the draft. So men tried to find ways around the draft so that they used medical exemptions, they used conscientious objector status, and they got college deferments. For those who didn't or couldn't seek a way out, they were either drafted or in some cases they actually moved to Canada. As a result of the fact that most of the kids who were able to get deferments or conscientious objector status or were able to get medical exemptions were white and generally upper middle class, what happened was that the military was made up mostly of minorities and lower income whites. And as a result of that, it was known as the working class war. In our family, my uncle actually enlisted in order to avoid getting drafted to go to Vietnam, and he ended up in Korea. And my aunt and her husband moved to Canada because her husband wanted to avoid the draft. Well, the Pentagon Papers, which were released by Daniel Ellsberg in 1970, showed that the government had actually planned to enter the war, even though President Johnson said that they weren't going to. They were never going to send American troops to Vietnam. The papers also showed that they had no intention of leaving Vietnam so long as the North Vietnamese were still there. Essentially, the Pentagon Papers showed to the people of the United States how untrustworthy the government was at that time. Eventually, the war ended on March 29, 1973, when U.S. combat troops left Vietnam.